Okay, so let's now finish off the basic functionality from the GetRawData class that we started in the previous video for the Flickr browser. Okay, continuing on, the other thing we need, or we want to do in the GetRawData constructor is we want to set an initial state of our download status. So we're going to put this .m download status equals download status dot idle. So by default, when we create a new instance of this class, it's idle. It's not doing anything at this stage. And just in line with that, it's good practice also to have a reset method. Public void reset. And that one's going to sort of reset the status. So it'll be back to also idle. But also the other thing it'll do, it'll also reset the URLs and the data. Equals null, and we'll make those both null. Data, oops. Okay, so we'll add that as well. We'll be using that later. We now also need a getter for both the status, because that status we want to access that elsewhere possibly, and also for the data itself. So again, Command N on a Mac, and I believe it's Control N on Windows. We just want to do a getter. We don't need both of them, and we're going to select. I'm just holding down Shift, pressing down arrow, and selecting. Selecting this time the data and also the download status. I'm going to click on OK. And you can see it's created the getters for us so that we can access that elsewhere. Now at this point we need to start thinking about downloading the file. Now the code's going to be very similar to the code that was in the XML top 10 download project, because all we're doing at this point, remember this is the raw data, we're only downloading it and we're literally going to save it into this string m data, and we're going to be processing it elsewhere. So we need to create a public sort of download raw data class. I'm going to do that here, public class. Oops. I'm sure you remember this from the previous one, previous project. Async task. And the input parameter is going to be a string. We're not going to do any sort of progress because it's only going to be a small file and it's going to be very quick. And we're going to return a string. Okay, then we need two functions, as you know from last time. Protected void. We need an on post execute. And that's got a parameter which will be the data that's sort of coming back from the web call, the download. I'll put that down a little bit so it's more readable, and I'll fill that in. I'll put to do fill in later. Okay, we'll come back to that. And of course we need the download. Protected string, and of course that one's due in background. String, and it's the multiple parameters. If you recall, it can accept multiple parameters even though we're only going to be assuming and using the very first parameter. So now we need to fill this out. We need to obviously return something. So first things first, we need to create our connection. I'm not going to comment a lot on this only because we've seen this in the previous video and be a bit redundant to go through that again. So if you haven't done the top 10 apps project, I suggest you have a look at that because this code isn't explained in a lot more detail. Oops, buffered reader that should be. Okay. And we're just going to do a test to see if they haven't passed anything successful to us. And we're just going to return immediately. If we don't get any valid data, we are going to return immediately. Now you notice there with that buffered reader, it's coming up saying automatically, do you mean java.io.bufferedReader? And if that's the case, you can see it's got alt return will automatically add that for me. Pretty similar to how Eclipse does things. And of course, if we scroll up, we'll notice that the buffered reader hasn't been added. The other cool thing I want to show you though is there's a way to automate this. Instead of having to manually do that all the time, this is a computer, so let's get the computer to do some of the stuff, for us to make our life a little bit easier. So I go into preferences again, back to editor. This time go to auto import. Now it's got an option here at the moment. It asks insert imports on paste, but we want to change that. That's if we're pasting, but also we want to change these as well. And what I suggest you do is change that to all, optimize imports on the fly, add unambiguous imports on the fly. So in other words, we're getting this Android Studio to do a little bit more work for us. So it's going to try and paste stuff in automatically for us without us having to do it all the time. And if you want to, you can exclude and do things like that, but I don't normally bother. And click on OK. So what I mean by that is it's going to be a little bit smarter now. So for example, I could actually delete the imports. And did you notice what happened? It's added them again. So again, I can just go delete, and it actually adds them automatically. So, and the other thing it'll do as I'm typing a little bit further, it'll be adding these automatically, so you're not having to manually do them. Now, it does mean there's a chance that it might get one wrong, but because I selected import unambiguous ones automatically, you shouldn't run into any problems with that. Okay, I'm going to type a little bit more just to show you what I mean and how this works. We're going to add our catch block. Catch. We're looking for an IO exception. We'll do a log here. Log this as an error, log.e. Remember our log tag? That's going to be our log tag, so we always know, which class the errors come from. Error. And show the error as well. And that's okay. The error is not thrown yet because we haven't added the code to do that. And then we're going to also add a finally. And we'll come back and add to that in a minute. The other thing I want to point out here is, as we scroll up, you notice how it added the IO exception automatically. You didn't see that happen in the background, but as IO exception, it knew straight away that was something that needed to be added. It was unambiguous, so it added it for us automatically. So this is what I'm talking about with those changes, just making it a lot easier. So you're not having to sort of do this extra stuff yourself, getting the computer to do the work for you. Okay, let's continue. Okay, this is like the previous one. We're going to open up the first parameter, and that's what we're going to try and download, whatever the contents of that is. Open connection. Use a standard get for this, again as per the previous project, and then we do a connect. We need to create our input stream. Get the input stream. Okay, the buffer. Ultimately is going to be storing all our data. Need to initialize that. String buffer. And again, just scrolling up, you notice it added this automatically for us as well, the URL. So it's just working there nicely in the background, adding those things, just saving us a little bit of typing. Yes, I'm lazy. Okay, actually what I should have done there was put if input stream is nil. Basically means we've got no data, so we're just going to return null. There's no point processing if there's nothing to process. Okay, so we're initializing our buffer that's going to store our data. And then we want to start reading. So we're going to put reader equals new buffered reader. And the new input stream reader from the input stream. Okay, then we need a temporary variable to store each sort of line of text. Then we need to test to see whether that is whether we're at the end of the file, basically. And we do that with equals reader dot read line not equal to null. So essentially, we want to keep processing while we've got some data. That should have been 2 there, like so. And then buffer, we want to append the data that we have read this time, line, and I'm also adding a carriage return just for readability reasons. Technically we don't need this last part because the computer doesn't care whether there's a carriage return to make it make it go to the next line or not. It'll process it quite nicely either way. I like to add that normally. Okay, then if we've got down to this point, it means that we've processed and we've added all the data. We've been right through to the end. So at this point we can return. So we can return the buffer. And the buffer isn't a string yet, it's a string buffer, so we've got to return the toString version of that buffer. So that's essentially the process, and then we just need to fill in our finally. Need a bit of space there. So, and the finally, which of course is executed every time, we need to make sure we close the connection. But we do want to test whether it is opened as well, just so we don't get an error if there's some problem. So dot disconnect. Just cleaning up after yourself. Very important as the programmer to be doing that. And also we need to do the same for the reader as well. And if a reader is not equal to null, we're doing a try here. We're going to do a reader dot close. But we also need to catch an exception trying to do the close. It's a final IO exception. Whoops. And if we have got an error, we're going to log that. Log.tag. We probably shouldn't get this, but if we do, for debugging purposes, we'll do that and then we'll sort of look at deal with that later. And we also need to return here if there is an error. That should get that make that error disappear, which it has. Okay. So we've now got that working. So that's our basic routine, which is just going to accept the raw data or download the raw data without any processing. So next we need to go back to our on post execute, of course, what happens after we've downloaded. And this is the one up here that was filled in. I'm going to change that now. So we want to store our mdata, or our data in our mdata variable, class variable. And that's going to be the web data, that's the data that's been returned. But we also want to do a bit of processing here. So why don't we just take the opportunity just for testing purposes to log the output at this point. We'll go that to verbose, log tag, and we'll put data returned was mdata just to make sure that's working. But we also want to do a bit of testing here. So we want to put if mdata, we want to update the download status basically. So if it was returned as nothing, and if the reason it was returned was nothing was because the URL wasn't passed, then we want to change the download status to tell the calling process that the reason that it failed was because you didn't initialize the class. You didn't send us a valid or a URL at all because the URL was empty. Otherwise, if it was still null, but there was a valid URL, then it has to be been an error accessing that URL for some reason. So we're going to change the download status to failed or empty, and we'll leave it to the calling process to define, which is which there essentially. Otherwise, if it wasn't null, that's good. It means it succeeded. Success here. And we set that to OK. Download status equals download status.ok. So that's all that process is going to do. It's going to execute, save the data, and then depending on the status and what happened, it's going to change the status so that the calling process can then change that if necessary. Okay, we now need to call this GetRawData. We're going to do that from our main activity. I'm going to go back over to there. And just in the onCreate is where we normally call stuff. So I'm going to put something in there. And that it will be GetRawData, the raw data equals new GetRawData. And of course we need that URL, which we're going to paste in there shortly. We're going to get that. And that's this URL there. We're going to use that exact URL that we validated to be okay. We're going to put that in there. Okay, that's in there. But of course we need an execute process. We haven't yet got an execute process in our GetRawData, so we need to quickly add that because we've initialized the class, but of course we haven't invoked the async task to start the download. So we need to create another function to do that, and we're going to create that in here, just below the getters. I'm going to call that execute, and that will be a public void execute. So to change that, we want to change the status. The download status equals download status.processing. And then we want to invoke, of course, the new thread, effectively the new async task, so that it starts downloading for us. So download data, so it'll be download raw data equals new download raw data. And of course, we want to do download data raw data dot execute, and we want to pass the parameter, which was of course the mraw URL, which we saved in our constructor up here. Okay, so we've now got an execute process in our GetRawData, but we haven't invoked that yet. So we need to go to our main activity, go to the end of the line, the raw data dot execute, and that should be it. So at this point, we should be able to get something to work. So if we have a look and make sure that our emulator is running, I've got an Android virtual device, Genymotion one, but you can be using anyone. You can be using a physical device or just the standard Android virtual device, whatever you want to do. I'm going to run that. I'll just switch over here to make sure it does work. I'll unlock that while I can. I'll choose my Genymotion emulator, and we've got an error. So we need to check our log. And what I'm going to suggest you use, what I use, the tools, the Android device monitor. I personally just like to having that in a window, and certainly in situations like this where we haven't got a lot of screen real estate, it makes sense to use that. And I'm just going to have a look at the errors. Let's just have a bit of a look here and see why it crashed. And scrolling down, and of course I missed an internet permission. If you recall, we have to go back to our Android manifest file and add the internet permission. So users permission, and I can just type in internet and it should find it for me, and then slash. Okay, so if I go back now to main activity and run this again, hopefully it'll work this time. We've got our emulator running, click on OK. This time we haven't got a crash, which is good, and we go back to our monitor, and you can see we've got obviously got some raw data showing up in there. And data return was, and a list of all the data. So at this point we've got our raw data class going. So I'm going to end this video here. In the next video, we're going to take this up a notch, and we're going to create another class where we're going to do the JSON parsing. So that's sort of going to build on this class as a subclass and use the functionality in this class, but also build upon it and add JSON specific sort of formatting and extraction tools so that we can manipulate that JSON data. So I'll see you in the next video.